Very interesting. तो let's get into the currency aspect. करेंसी रेट्स जो होते हैं, लाइक आपने बताया कि अगर इंडिया में 5% है और यूएस में 4% है, फिर भी यूएस प्रेफर करेगी बिकॉज ऑफ द करेंसी रिस्क
They may, based on track record,
हाँ,
etc. Yeah.
तो क्या, लाइक हाउ डज द करेंसी रिस्क वर्क, एंड करेंसी जो चेंज होती है, अप्रिशिएट डेप्रिशिएट, हाउ डज दैट अफेक्ट द स्टॉक मार्केट्स?
Okay, well, it's again an excellent question, also a huge topic by itself. Other things being equal, जो हमेशा रियल लाइफ में इक्वल नहीं होते, बट यू स्टिल कॉन्सेप्ट समझाने के लिए बोलना जरूरी है. अगर मान लीजिए यूएस का 2% इन्फ्लेशन टारगेट है जो एक्चुअल में है, और इंडिया का 4% इन्फ्लेशन टारगेट है जो एक्चुअल में है. यूएस का 2% का इन्फ्लेशन का टारगेट लॉन्ग टर्म में काफी क्रेडिबल रहा है, हालांकि शॉर्ट टर्म में उसकी क्रेडिबिलिटी इश्यूज रही हैं क्योंकि 2022 में इतना बड़ा स्पाइक आ गया था इन्फ्लेशन में. इंडिया का इन्फ्लेशन टारगेट की क्रेडिबिलिटी नहीं है, न्यू है, नॉट नहीं है, बट ऑफ लेट एक्चुअली स्ट्रांग हो रही है बिकॉज आरबीआई, फॉर गुड ऑफ अ वर्स, took a lot of economic pain for the country but tried to defend the headline inflation number of 4%. Like Shaktikanta Das did not cut rates for a long time, क्योंकि 4% के ऊपर था. Now finally when food inflation has come down and your CPI headline has gone below 4, we've had 2 cuts and we may have a third cut soon. एक separate debate है कि should we have seen food inflation as part of overall inflation, because food तो is more linked to weather etc, not based on what RBI does. कितना wheat उग रहा है, कितना rice उग रहा है, that's a separate issue. But the point of credibility is, are you ready to take pain? The central bank in India was ready to take pain to defend a 4% target. So what I'm saying is, let us say आप believe करते हो कि अमेरिका में broadly speaking 2% inflation रहेगा, शायद थोड़ा ज्यादा. इंडिया में broadly speaking 4% inflation रहेगा, शायद थोड़ा ज्यादा. Then other things being equal, a 2% inflation difference means every year the rupee should depreciate by 2%. Is the consequence of that logic, other things being equal. Why? मान लीजिए, just to keep the concept easy, just assume $1 is 100 rupees, right? If $1 is 100 rupees and you can exchange goods or services at a particular equilibrium price, India, wo $1, you're creating, let's say, some good, let's call that good X. वो $1 का $1.02 का कॉस्ट हो गया अगले साल यूएस में, राइट? इंडिया में वो 100 रुपीज से 104 रुपीज हो गया, बिकॉज दोनों का इन्फ्लेशन के बेसिस पे उसका कॉस्ट बढ़ गया. नाउ फॉर दैट गुड टू बी इक्वली वैल्यूएबल इन बोथ द कंट्रीज, योर न्यू एक्सचेंज रेट शुड बी $1.02 equal to 104 rupees.
Yeah.
Which basically comes to roughly $1 equal to 102 rupees now. Technically 101.9 ऐसा कुछ होगा, but 102. So you can see that other things being equal, inflation difference, जिस कंट्री की इन्फ्लेशन ज्यादा है, उस डिफरेंस से उसकी करेंसी इन रिलेटिव टर्म्स डिप्रिशिएट करनी चाहिए.
Okay.
ये क्लियर हो गया?
Yes.
Now this is just on that. Of course the starting point is not always the same. Real life में everything else is not equal. इसमें एक और कॉन्सेप्ट ये आता है, as a country grows richer, there are 3 components on this. One was जो मैंने आपको समझाया, अब जो बोलूंगा थर्ड कंपोनेंट में आता हूं. So there is one what is known as relative price differences, you can call it. Second you can call structural growth. इन सबके इकोनॉमिक इक्विवेलेंट टर्म्स भी हैं, लेकिन मैं आपको एकदम इजी भाषा में बता रहा हूं. और थर्ड इज अ साइक्लिकल एलिमेंट. सो देयर इज अ सिंपल इन्फ्लेशन डिफरेंशियल, देन देयर इज अ स्ट्रक्चरल ट्रेंड ऑफ द करेंसी और द कंट्री, एंड थर्ड इज अ साइक्लिकल ट्रेंड. इन तीनों की कॉम्बिनेशन से करेंसी डिटरमिन होती है. फिर उसका हम इम्पैक्ट सोचेंगे इक्विटी मार्केट्स या मोर ब्रॉडली मार्केट्स में क्या होता है. तो फर्स्ट पॉइंट तो आप समझ गए कि जब 2% का डिफरेंस है तो अदर थिंग्स इक्वल 2% डिप्रिशिएट करना चाहिए. सेकंड इज, अब मान के चलो, मैं आपको एक रफ एग्जांपल देता हूं. $50,000 की सैलरी अमेरिका में रफली 10 लाख के बराबर है इंडिया में इन टर्म्स ऑफ परचेजिंग पावर.
$50,000 इज 10 लाख
इन टर्म्स ऑफ परचेजिंग पावर.
हाँ, एक्चुअल नंबर होगा 50,000 into 80,
42-43 lakhs.
Okay.
Roughly 10-11, that's not the point. Roughly it is roughly 10 lakhs. Because even though an iPhone may be roughly the same price, adjusting for taxes or tariffs, etc., your haircut is not. Your haircut you can even in Mumbai get for 200 rupees at a reasonable place. You will not get it for less than $20 at a half reasonable place in New York. New York तो even ज़्यादा होगा, but even other places. When I was in college there, तभी हम $15 देते थे, almost a गाँव.
अभी मेरा फ्रेंड गया था न्यूयॉर्क में, $50 था उसका.
हाँ, तो मैं न्यूयॉर्क तो एक अलग लेवल पे हो गया, but even nothing less than $20-25. I mean, haircut is a very, very obvious example, but there are many other things like child care. It's so common for people in middle class India to have domestic help. Like only the very rich have domestic help in the US, right? Because इसको टेक्निकल भाषा में अगेन इसका टर्म्स होता है, बट ब्रॉडली बिकॉज द कॉस्ट ऑफ अ ह्यूमन बीइंग्स टाइम इज मच मोर इन द यूएस. दैट्स द पॉइंट ऑफ अ रिच सोसाइटी, राइट? Which is why Uber there is much more expensive than Uber in India. Even if the car is the same. Cars generally same नहीं होती, but अगर same होता भी तो भी. Which is why जब automotive self-driving cars आएंगी, there will be a much bigger difference in pricing in the US as opposed to in India. Because India में भी of course person के time की value है, but as a percentage is not as high of the overall trip as it is in the US. So there are things which are tradable and there are things which are not tradable. Generally, goods are tradable. Asterisks aside, generally services are not tradable. I'm not talking about IT services to export होते हैं. Services as in healthcare, education, haircut, etc., right? Where you have to be physically present to go somewhere. So if you do a weighted average, roughly it's around 4.5 times, at least 4 times. Cost of living in America compared to India. For China, for example, it's 2 times compared to America. So if you start seeing a pattern as a country grows richer, that times, the differential in the cost of living, that multiplier starts reducing. Which is China is more advanced, so China में 2 times है. Parts of Europe may be not as rich as America, but maybe definitely richer than China. Of course, much richer than India. So there the difference may be 1.3 times, 1.4 times. Right? So you're seeing a pattern. So as a country grows richer, and India is growing faster than the US in percentage terms, this 4 times also starts compressing to 3.5 times, 3 times on a structural basis. इसको economics में बोलते हैं Balassa-Samuelson, but let's not go by the technical term. तो वो 2% तो आपका inflation difference के कारण रुपये depreciate करना चाहिए. ये आपका खुद में going forward अपने में 2% आराम से होना चाहिए. I don't want to get into the math of it, वो बहुत complicated हो जाएगा. But वो आपका जो structural inflation के कारण depreciation हो रहा है, because as you can understand, assuming India closes the gap in percentage terms, that 4x becomes 3.5x, 3.3x, 3.2x. So that allows the currency to appreciate, right? Because आपका $1 is actually 86 rupees on market exchange. But in terms of cost of living, it's 20 rupees. Now 20 and 86 का 4.3 का ratio है. और 20 का अगले साल 21 हो गया. 2% से भरा तो 20 रुपीज 40 पैसा हुआ एक्चुअली, बट वो 4.3 के बदले 4 पे आ गया. तो 20.4 into 4 क्या होता है? ऑलमोस्ट
81.6 करेक्ट,
राइट? तो आपने देखा वो कम हो गया. इट मे बी नॉट 81%, इट मे बी 83.6, बट वो कम हो गया. दैट्स एन अप्रिसिएशन. सो देयर इज अ इन्फ्लेशन डिफरेंस. There is a structural appreciation of the poor country which is growing fast, provided it is growing fast, provided it is closing the gap. And third, there is a cyclical element on top of that, which is actually in the short term the most important element. So 2002 to 2011 was the last dollar down cycle or half down cycle. मैं 2008-9 को exclude करता हूँ, which was the global financial crisis, जब dollar briefly spike किया था. So people who may remember 2002 में, for example, despite inflation being much higher, उस समय तो इंडिया में 4% नहीं, much higher था. हम तो WPI रिपोर्ट करते थे. CPI तब था भी नहीं इंडिया में. 2011-12 में चालू हुआ CPI. WPI is wholesale price inflation, CPI is consumer price inflation. 2002 में dollar rupee was at 50 and 2007 में एक बार 40 पे आ गया था. In fact 38-39 तक चला गया था. So it's not unheard of over 5 years for the rupee to actually appreciate in nominal terms against the dollar also. Because the dollar was then in a down cycle against a basket of currencies. Then from 2011 to early 2025, according to me, it may have peaked in February, but we can come to it later on, was the up cycle. Which is why, despite this time lower inflation gap, the rupee kept on depreciating by 3-4%. That 3-4% was not because of the inflation gap or the structural. The structural thing remained. Inflation gap came down. But the cyclical component was a headwind for USD-INR. If the cycle now turns, which I am positing it is turning this year, although again, in finance or economics, everything is a probability. Nothing is a physics kind of formula. But I'm positing it is turning this year. It may have already turned in February with this Trump war, trade war leading to the dollar index actually falling despite global uncertainty. Assuming that thesis is correct, इस बार क्योंकि आपका वो 2% और 2% तो roughly cancel out कर रहा है, वो आपका cyclical headwind tailwind बन जाएगा. That is what brings back, which is completely unheard of. not just for me, even more so for younger people like yourself, because हमने तो खाली डॉलर को रुपये के खिलाफ अप्रिशिएट करते हुए देखा है, राइट, बाय एवरेज 3-4%. और 2002 to 2007 कितने लोगों को याद है? और उसके पहले भी रुपये डिप्रिशिएट कर रहा था. So, but this time, because the inflation gap is less, the structural gap is more in GDP per capita, not GDP per capita, and the cyclical headwind becomes a tailwind. The rupee can actually appreciate. Now, let us say it appreciates. We can keep on debating the extent of appreciation and when exactly it happens, and we'll come to it again. What does it mean for investing? It means for investing is, let us say, I'm just taking an example for educational purposes. You are a hedge fund manager sitting in New York, and you are analyzing Asian Paints. आपने वही DCF, NPV, APV किया, आपने जो explain किया, cash flows divide by 1 plus discount rate करके आपने किया. तो आपने निकाला कि IRR, internal rate of return, in rupee terms is 15%, let us say. आपने अपने एक्सेल के नीचे एक और लाइन बना ली, IRR in USD terms, वो आपने बोला 12%. क्यों? क्योंकि आप 15 साल से देख रहे हो कि USD INR roughly 3% से डिप्रिशिएट करता है. But if that is not the case, that was just a long cycle, and therefore we could not understand it's a cycle on a day-to-day basis. If that 15 instead of becoming 12 becomes 17, then other things being equal, are you more likely to invest in Indian equities or less? More likely, right? Because now your dollar returns are higher. You are thinking in dollar terms, right? Because you are living in New York, your investors are based in the US. Or even if you are based out of London, your investors may be in the US. You may be based out of Singapore or Dubai, but your investors may primarily be US focused, even if they are not American themselves. Because America still is around half of the global market cap, 1/4 of the global economy, right? So now that 15% rupee returns, instead of becoming 12% dollar returns, becomes, say, 17% dollar returns. That is when the FIIs start to come back. So the last 10 years in Indian markets, it's a very interesting point. 2025 could be the 10th straight calendar year of positive returns in Indian markets. Even the COVID calendar year, 31st December market was higher than 1st January. Oh. The lockdown happened in March. If this year is positive, and already we are seeing a lot of momentum the last month or so, or 3 weeks or so, this will be the 10th straight year. But what makes it doubly fascinating is this has happened while the FII ownership of Indian markets has fallen from around a quarter, so 24-25%, about a decade or 12 years ago, to today around 16% or a sixth. So despite FIIs in the secondary market on a relative basis selling, Indian markets have basically gone ahead year after year for a decade almost. Of course, why? Because of domestic money and ROE and growth and everything else that we discussed so far. But if the dollar cycle turns and the FIIs also come back and seeing the markets do well, people start increasing their SIPs. जो 3-4 महीने से लोग थोड़ा हिल गए, they did not necessarily opt out, but their confidence was slightly shaken, or they did not increase the amount of SIP on average, whatever it was. They start doubling down and FIIs start returning. You can imagine what happens with the Indian markets multiples. Of course, there will be a reaction to that also. Promoters will sell a bit more. Institutional investors may sell a bit more, domestic ones on the margin, but then they'll have more cash. More public issuances will come, more IPOs will happen, more FPOs will happen, more QIPs will happen. But kitna absorb ho payega, it remains an open question. So the interesting thing about this is it's not just an academic macro discussion everything is interlinked with geopolitics and domestic politics and etc. It has real world implications on your and my portfolio and anybody's portfolio who's watching this.
If you learned something new from this video, do share it with your friends and subscribe to this channel so that we can bring you the best content possible. Also, if you want to watch this entire episode, click on the link in the description box and you can go to Kushal Lodha YouTube channel and watch the entire podcast episode. Thank you so much for watching this and have an amazing day.